Recording.
Okay, so first question is, what is your name and how would you like to be referred to?
My name's Chris Jones. You can call me Chris or anything. I don't mind Christopher. Chris is fine. Yeah.
And what organisation are you a part of?
I'm part of, or a volunteer at, let me start again. I'm a volunteer at the Friends of Hemmingfield Colliery.
And what made you want to get involved with that organisation?
Well, I was born locally and I've always been interested in sort of Earl Fitzwilliam's Wentworth Woodhouse estate and the history of mining and just industrial history more generally in this area. And also when I used to visit my grandma in Hoyland, I used to literally get a bus that went past the Hemmingfield Colliery pit site, and it always seemed a bit this strange, dark, abandoned, or seemed to be abandoned site that I passed, and that would have been in sort of the 90s, and then in the 2000s when the Friends group kind of took on the site, 2014, I took the opportunity to get in touch, and I've been going ever since.
Now, you might be quite young then. In fact, when were you born, sorry, Chris?
1980.
1980, so
Yep.
I'm going to assume you don't remember the pit closing at Elsecar.
Well, you're never quite sure whether it's in photographs or when people's reactions around you, but certainly people I went to school with, and on my road that growing up in West Melton, there were people on that road whose parents worked at Elsecar Main. So I do sort of, I wasn't an active player obviously, but I was vaguely aware of sort of like change happening, and I do remember the very vague sense of the headgear at Elsecar. When you went down the road from West Melton to Elsecar and Hoyland, you could see the headgear, and across the bridge that was at the corner when you swing round Both Road. So I do remember sort of the final bit, if you like, but only as a very young child.
And so when you saw we'll get onto these questions a bit, sorry, but when you actually saw that headgear then gone, how did that make you feel?
I think, to be honest, you're just really conscious that there'd been this big transition, and it for quite a long while afterwards, when I was growing up at school, you could sort of see the impact on the change of employment opportunity. There was sort of a mixture of people leaving really to find work elsewhere, but also new opportunities, attempted opportunities to invest in the area. Things like enterprise sort of site at Brampton. I think the Queen or some royal came and opened it in the 80s, and I remember that because that was near school. But it was really sort of quite a big downturn for this area, so I do remember the impact in that sense, more sort of antisocial behaviour and sort of things seeming a bit sort of miserable in a way for quite a while when I was growing up. People had left. There was less money around, so you did see the impact.
That's fascinating. So coming to these questions then, so I know this first one was a vague one, so I think we'll focus more on its relation to Elsecar then.
Okay.
So Hemmingfield itself then, what was the impact of Elsecar's growth on Hemmingfield and, if you know, any nearby areas?
Yeah, I suppose really, it's geographically speaking, obviously it's not too far away, so there is always a bit of a pull in terms of the immediate vicinity of Elsecar, pulling people in to work in and around Elsecar's industrial undertakings, whether it was the furnaces, the ironworks later on, or the pits, or the ironstone mines more at Tankersley, I suppose. So there's always been a bit of a pull away from the sort of agricultural labourers, which there still were. There were quite a lot of farms round about Hemmingfield and out towards West Melton, Brampton, all that area towards Wath really. That was the larger parish. But I suppose you could say the whole area, the main change, yes, Elsecar was the end point, but the whole sort of dynamic of change through the area was with the coming of the canal in the turn of the sort of 19th century. The canal had actually arrived at Elsecar, the Elsecar branch of the Durn and Dove Canal, in 1798-ish. I think that's right. The colliery had opened. Earl Fitzwilliam had sort of extended the canal from Cobker Ing right up to his colliery, more or less where the Newcomen engine is now. And just that transition, that bringing of a branch through from sort of Wunwell really, off the main line between Swinton, Wath and Wunwell, through all that area, through Hemmingfield. That's what brought, trade in and out, more people, all the pubs, the whole area of Tingle Bridge, which was a bridge before the canal over the Knoll Beck at Hemmingfield, but really the extra trade, a number of people bringing sort of humber keels and barges really in and out of that area past Tingle Bridge meant the whole new sort of core to the village sort of exploded. The most visible sign of it, I suppose, really is the number of pubs and beer houses that went around Tingle Bridge. In some respects, Hemmingfield seems like a long way away. You've got the school at the top of the hill and sort of the older village up there and some of the farms. But the pull towards the canal for Elsecar's sort of transport revolution, if you like, it is really one of the main sort of catalysts for change in Hemmingfield. And then the collieries, different pits sinking at different times, including Hemmingfield or Elsecar colliery. And that was just an expansion, if you like. So the pull effect to Elsecar was the Elsecar branch of the canal, I suppose, and all the different industries there, mineral and ironworks and things. And then the later development of pits spread out as different sort of different levels, different seams were being worked. And actually the Barnsley bed had been exhausted in the core of Elsecar, so they had to go further afield, still on Earl Fitzwilliam's land, but into Hemmingfield. It's still really Elsecar area, but it's strictly speaking Hemmingfield village.
That's brilliant, thank you. So again, another vague question, so maybe I'll narrow it down to some more talking points. So a history of Hemmingfield Colliery then. Maybe when did it open? When did it shut? Why did it shut? Maybe.
Okay, I mean, so we talked about kind of Elsecar, the centre of Elsecar, and the sort of furnace being there, and then the colliery, what's called the New Colliery, which is the Georgian 1795 colliery. There are a series of different pits around Elsecar. There was sort of a following on from Elsecar New. There was a Elsecar High pit, which closed in the 1880s. That was also near Milton Ironworks. There were multiple shafts for that. When those sort of pits had been more or less worked out, they were looking for new areas to expand the extraction. And really that's when two more pits, one of which was Hemmingfield, came on stream. Hemmingfield started sinking about 1842. Took quite a long time, till about 1848, partly because they hit so much water when they were sort of sinking the shaft, and also just because it was a bit of an economic downturn as well in 1842 when they started, so they weren't super keen to kind of blow loads of money on it. So 1848-ish, Hemmingfield's more or less been sunk and they're starting to work the coal. 1853, closer to the canal by the old, or by the new colliery, was Simon Wood, which you might be familiar with, where there's a sign now. So those two pits were the new sort of big pits, if you like, working the Barnsley bed to take over from the older pits that were sort of slowly closing over the next 20 years. Hemmingfield worked from 1848 right through to 1920. And to be honest, the main reason it stopped working was just the exhaustion of the seams. The Barnsley bed had been worked out for quite a wide area, following on from the previous extraction. They'd also been mined all the sort of take, as it's called, that the Earl Fitzwilliam could really extract coal from, and they'd even started taking coal from sort of higher seams, thinner seams, which were less profitable, so less desirable to work. But if you're trying to get the most out of the investment, the shafts that you've got, the pumping equipment and everything to win the coal and get it out onto the canal, get it out onto the railways from 1850 onwards, then you really want to kind of get the bang for the buck, as it were. And so really by 1920 they'd exhausted the Barnsley bed and its time was up, so that's why it stopped winning coal, but it survived as a pumping station.
Fascinating. And so as a pumping station, what collieries did it operate with and when did that stop really happening?
I mean, in a way, this is a sort of tribute to the forward-thinking nature and planning of mining engineering across the whole estate for Earl Fitzwilliam's estate, which is obviously Elsecar, but also at Greasborough Park Gate. In order to kind of like develop the mineral on both sites, they kind of introduced a massive drainage scheme between Elsecar, Hemmingfield, and right through to Westfield, which is sort of behind Romarsh Church. And there are sort of underground connections really between all three. And so when the Barnsley seam at those sort of sites had been exhausted in, let's say, late 19th, early 20th century, Hemmingfield survived to 1920. But that whole scheme was bought out from Earl Fitzwilliam and 15 different colliery companies round about, the ones that were sort of newer and still working. They thought, well, if we keep this drainage scheme working and keep it pumping, all the water that goes down to that sort of drainage scheme can be kept away from our workings. So our sort of seam workings in the Barnsley seam and deeper, they won't have to encounter and work with that water. And it sounds a strange thing, but really the threat of flooding and flooding out your workings when you're digging very, very close by, albeit with a barrier of coal, is a very serious threat. It's a very expensive potential loss of earnings. So the sort of insurance, if you like, indemnity sense of having a pumping scheme that could keep that whole area for miles around dry is why the Hemmingfield sort of colliery became a pumping station from 1920 right through really till they stopped pumping in about 1988, 1989, and then into the 2000s when the coal industry had disappeared in this area. Elsecar Main had shut, Cottonwood had shut, obviously, and then Maltby and further on in the 1990s. There was no real need for it. It was sort of a care and maintenance asset that had sort of been retained because it could be used but had no active purpose. And that's when it was given over to the Friends, or given over, the Friends secured it.
Oh, fantastic. I think that brings us on quite nicely to actually the next one really is, so we've talked about the development of Elsecar and its impact on surrounding areas.
Mm-hmm.
So how did the closure of the coal industry around here, and even the, like you say, about the pumping stations, which aren't necessarily for digging coal but part of that industry,
Yep.
how did that impact Elsecar, and how did it also impact the surrounding areas then?
I mean, I think the whole area, because obviously Elsecar, everyone thinks about L. Fitzwilliam's pits, which obviously in the with the Coal Industry Act of 1946 were taken away from the landed gentry and became the property of the people in 1947 in January. Fair enough, but it wasn't just one set of pits, it was all the pits in this area. So like, although we're telling the story of Elsecar and Elsecar Main and the associated pits, every colliery around here effectively kind of closed. So the same impact, albeit on a different time scale, was felt, you know, throughout South Yorkshire, throughout West Yorkshire, throughout the north of England, from the 80s onwards. The privatised industry sort of staggered on from 1994 onwards, but without really a secure future. So people went further away if they were still in mining, or if they were older, they took a sort of retirement, sort of redundancy package or something. And I think that really had a big impact. People having to sort of potentially learn new skills at that age with support. You know, it's a very difficult transition for people, and people did move away. You know, as we talked about before, I think. But and that affected the entire area. I don't think you can just say Elsecar. I think you've got to say South Yorkshire. You know, there's a reason why in the sort of 90s, 2000s, South Yorkshire as a whole area was sort of designated as Objective 1, meritus of Objective 1 funding from the European Union, because it had structural weaknesses that a sort of post-industrial community had to deal with. Where was the money going to come from? Where to provide the services, and the longer-term health problems as well from industrial-related diseases, and the social problems that have come up, famous, I suppose, against post-industrial societies that have come along with that. So it did take a long time, and you can sort of see its after effects, I suppose, down at Wath, where you've got Dearne Valley College on the site of sort of Wath Main and Manvers. The whole decontamination of that huge area took a very long time, and new industries sprung up on the site, which seemed quite strange. Instead of people coming to work at a coking plant or in a deep mine, you've got people working in a different way in call centres or in distribution depots, and again, the wage profile is probably quite different, and the skills and sort of sense of camaraderie is quite different, I think. Equally, there are positives, I'm sure, in terms of education opportunities, the diversity of the workforce of men and women. Really, I think is quite a big change, and you can see it at Cottonwood as well, which is obviously much closer, just literally down the road from Elsecar. Elsecar Main shut. There's really nothing on that site now. You've got the Georgian and the Victorian elements remaining. Cottonwood, you've got a retail park. Cottonwood Illuminations, the Dearne Towns Link Road, which is Dearne Valley Parkway, that transformed that area commercially. Whether it's exactly comparable, whether the jobs are the same, I think it's a debate to be had. But it did take a long time when you think about sort of the 80s closure right through to the 2000s, that you got this economic regeneration and different sort of employment opportunities.
It's brilliant. I think that also brings us on quite nicely to the penultimate question, actually, which is really then, so with these industries having impacts outside of Elsecar and these nearby ones,
yep.
How did those communities almost interact with each other, to the best of your knowledge? What kind of relations did they have?
During the sort of 80s or after closures of...
During their time period, during when they were active, what sort of interactions would these industrial communities have? For example, Newton Chambers...
Yes, all right, sorry. I mean, a lot of it is when you've got to think of a whole family. I mean, it's certainly in terms of employment opportunities, going back to Victorian and Georgian times, what the father did, the sons would do. It's a different sort of domestic situation in terms of gender roles. That's something I think you have to acknowledge, which is very different in sort of in this part of Yorkshire than maybe the Woollen district, or in sort of Rochdale or somewhere like that, where women had could be quite industrially active as well. But sort of men's role and boys' roles in the pit that meant, that you did potentially work with your father, your brother, your uncle, and at different stages, if you did get some education in the local school at Elsecar or Brampton or at Hemmingfield, you were quite, the pressure was to earn a wage to support the household, potentially larger household in terms of average number of children than now. And really, the connection with mining is a regional one, so that opportunity existed whether you're in Elsecar, whether you're in Munwell, whether you're in Brampton. The larger employers weren't just pits, but they were also industrial undertakings. Newton Chambers is an excellent example of that. Obviously, they leased minerals from Earl Fitzwilliam and Duke of Norfolk and other people, and that was a big employer. And in a way, you could move from one to the other, so there was always a job, and that is something that's not as, at the minute it's maybe quite a good time in a way. You could say there's there are plenty of jobs, but it weren't necessarily well-paying jobs. At that time, you really could, although there were economic upturns and downturns, you really could get a job quite quickly. Now there are more educational opportunities, and you might have to travel further to go to college, whether it's Dearne Valley College or to university in Sheffield or wherever, and that opportunity exists in a way that didn't before. Probably with the transport and the railway connections, you could sort of say that Victorian people had to really leave and change completely, and you can see that with the makeup of the population in Elsecar and around, and certainly Newton Chambers. The ironworks drew people from sort of the Black Country in the sort of 1840s and 50s. And then in the 20th century, there's a whole area of the sort of model villages referred to, the Earl Fitzwilliam sort of model village, that's referred to as Scotch village sometimes because the Scottish people, came in. So I think patterns of sort of migration for work, they've always been there, but they've maybe been a bit more dramatic during the sort of Victorian and early 20th century because they were very large employers. Now what you tend to find is sort of smaller employers, more casual labour, and I don't think people can move, but not necessarily in the group way that they did before. Yeah.
And what I particularly loved about that was his commentary on mirroring and social comparison to today.
Yeah.
To the extent that actually, I think this is probably something that ties in nicely to one of the final questions. Really, what are some of your favourite places in Elsecar today? Like, when you are about Elsecar, what is it you like about Elsecar?
Elsecar itself, I like the fact that it's well connected, which is you could say is a legacy of its development and its growth as a sort of an industrial community. So it's still well connected. It's not got as many railway kind of sidings and connections, but to be fair, they were more about transporting minerals than people. It is the conservation area and this mixture of not just old stuff, but some new conservation work, some new kind of attempts to kind of bring new uses to old buildings. I think that's quite important because ultimately you don't want to live in a museum. There might be things that interest you about the past, and certainly some of the products of that past if they've been well conserved. Because it's not just about preserving it, like a photograph. I think you do have to kind of find new uses that can respect the heritage and sort of hopefully open up new opportunities for jobs and cultural activities and things. So I quite like that. I quite like the fact there's a concentration of buildings that do have a history that is tied to the people and that the communities do respect that. So it's quite a friendly still place to be. It's not just the place and the people, that you do feel like you're connected to it. But on a sort of just heritage side, I do like the history of the building. So and I know my own family are connected to that. So I think I do personally feel quite a strong sense of place because of that.
I think you mentioned actually about this prior in a question, so apologies if this
That's okay.
Here, but that might be a good avenue just to quickly explore. What connection did your family have to this heritage then?
It's slightly complicated, let me think. Right, so historically, on both sides there are sort of mining connections and also metalwork connections. Probably more on my father's side and a little bit further away from Elsecar into sort of Darfield, but they sort of moved around into this area. They were sort of drawn to this area from Shropshire really, one of the branches, one of the Jones branches, and it was for mining, and people did move between pits because, as I said, there were opportunities to work. If you got a bit fed up or you didn't like what the job was, if you were a ripper, a collier, a haulier, you could move around. Obviously, you tend to go with your family, or family groups tended to work at the same pit. forgot what I was saying. Sorry, I've completely forgot what I was saying.
It's fine, we've all been there. So you're saying about your father's connection moving in.
Oh yeah, sorry, yeah. So there's my immediate family connection was that move in the sort of Victorian period. Going back a generation further, it's still sort of Victorian period. Over towards Swathe, there were different sets of pits there, and it's in that period when they are sinking deeper shafts, so they're encountering gas, so the danger is quite real. So I'm going to get the relationship wrong now, but probably the great granddad, he died in Swathe, I think it's 1875, Swathe pit explosion. So like my dad's granddad, he was effectively orphaned by that explosion, and that had a massive impact on his life, which to some extent kind of maybe explains why he moved away from mining while other parts of the family were still miners. That dominated his life really, and I think to some extent also his faith, but that's a sort of different story. But yeah, the family connections through mining, including the sort of industrial accidents and serious family disruption that caused it by it, do factor into my sort of family history. So I think that does make me more engaged with it. It's not just a job; it is a whole impact on your life, how your family lives, how it relates to the community, who who married who as well.
That's brilliant, and I think actually that's quite poignant coming on to this final question. How would you like to see Hemmingfield Colliery's heritage and maybe that general heritage in its entirety? How would you like to see that being remembered in for future generations?
I think to some extent, I'd like it to be connected with Elsecar, because I think there's a danger of you have like survivors of bits of the past, which without a sort of a overall connective tissue and saying, oh, the canal was there and it was worked, why was it there? It's not just a leisure, an amenity, which it is, but it came as it was the sort of shot in the arm of Elsecar that transformed its transport and created opportunities for trade and people to come and to go. I would like that to be kind of sort of restored in people's minds, if you like, this idea that it was a place of work that was connected to the transport. So Elsecar's connected to Hemmingfield, the village, but also with the pit, which is associated with the village. I mean, it's quite funny in a way that where the pit is effectively almost opposite the high point of Hemmingfield. So I think a lot of people, even in Hemmingfield, don't necessarily think of that pit as Hemmingfield's own pit, if you like. So I think that's being able to connect that back with the working history and the industrial sort of processes at Elsecar, fed by ironstone from Thorncliffe, as it may be, the Tankersley, bringing it down either to Milton Ironworks or to Elsecar Ironworks, supplied with coal and coke from the pits, to see it as a part of a sort of symbiotic relationship of people working in that area that produce things. That would be kind of a useful legacy. And I think it is kind of a useful part of the history as well, in terms of explaining the development of the technology, to understand how lives and ways of working change. You've not just got Georgian, you've got Victorian, and then you've got sort of the absence of the 20th century. So I think that contextualisation of the actual lived working life of how the different elements, transport, mining, production, ironworks, etc., how that all works together would be quite a good thing. And it would help connect the sites physically but logically. So yeah.
That's absolutely brilliant. Thank you. Well, unless there's anything else you really want to talk about, or anything else you feel like people should know about?
No, I mean, I think there are a lot of different aspects you could talk about, some of which are not just like the past boring history, close the book. There's a lot of lives and family connections that you can pull the thread at one place, and it suddenly connects into lots of other industries, or people change from one to another over time. As ironstone mining died out by the 1870s, people go back to mining. They were struggling to actually get ironstone miners because it was harder work than coal mining, for example, at different times. So there are little things like that, and you can see change in families because of it, and what people did. And I think apart from that, you could sort of see, well, what's the future? What is the heritage of those sites? I mean, there is a sort of environmental legacy, which I think is something we do need to acknowledge, and I think there are educational opportunities around that as well, which are probably could be useful to maybe in a limited way, to the local community, to schools and to visitors as well.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Chris.
Okay.
Well, I think that's everything from me then.
Is there anything here that could tell us about?
Do you want to talk maybe?
I can do. I mean, to be honest, what I was going to say, because did it make sense what I said there? Because I was a bit stream of consciousness.
Oh no, honestly, it was brilliant. I mean, everything was great. That answer about the heritage was perfect. Like that is fantastic.
Because you could set illustrations wise. So you've got. I mean, there is that map. I mean, I don't know. This is maybe more just so. There's that map as well, but there's a lot of like canal connections you can talk about, and it's more when you see it on a map that you start to realise the regional perhaps aspect and impact. I know thinking about it, I was like, well, unless I go through a list of individual pits, I don't know if that's helpful because people won't know where the pits are. Perhaps I could have maybe talked about Lund Hill and Hillies and the golf course there and everything. So I'm deploying the wrong tone when I'm saying this. Apologies. Yeah, when you look at you can look at this if you want, but like this is a sort of a Jeffreys map, famously almost Ordnance Survey level of 1 mile to 1 inch sort of mapping from the late 18th century. So it is pre-Ordnance Survey maps, and it's good because it sort of shows you the area almost before the coming of the canals, and there you do get a sense of how isolated these places can be. You might be near a guidepost or a milestone on the way to somewhere else. So you might go through past Hemmingfield or something, not really through Elsecar as such, but like past Hemmingfield on your way through to Barnsley if you were taking one of the main roads, somewhere one of the coach roads or one of the post roads. And that's part of the history of Hemmingfield. But like Elsecar, in a sense, there was no necessary reason for you to go there as opposed to Wentworth, the Great House or the Great Park, until the coming of the canal. So I think the canal really did transform the opportunities of all descriptions, whether it was to get drunk in a pub, play sport, play a brass band, or otherwise. Or if you look out to Thorncliffe, like the Newton Chambers, you can see there really that was 1793. Some enterprising people going and asking Earl Fitzwilliam, could we take a lease of this land and see if we can develop something, starting really small, employing 30 people and then going up to 300, 800, 7,000, I think, by sort of 20th century. And I think that's one thing that perhaps is a story that's missed a bit. It's actually, it sometimes feels a bit inevitable. Oh, these concerns succeeded and they just grew naturally, like inflation or something. It's always, profit's always going to increase, and that's not the case. And I think sometimes some of the interesting stories and certainly the personal drama, I suppose, possible lessons, I don't know. Economic history is not the most exciting. Comes out of the downturns, and Elsecar and Hemmingfield had downturns as like national and international trade, war, famine, you name it, floods affected whether things could work, and the industrial history as well, which obviously connects us to the present day in the sense of formation of unions and some of the really strong unions that formed around mining. You could talk about them, I suppose. But yeah, I'm blabbering on now. I was thinking this is more secondary illustrative material, really. So, but I'm trying to think what else I've got. I mean, there are canal maps and things. There's a lot of. The good thing about age of things is that canal maps you can pick out, places through it. I mean, I could probably talk forever about anything, but about the canal and the Hemmingfield was sort of important for canals in the sense that like one of the main solicitors, the agent of the Dernaduff Canal. Was a guy called John Burks, who is forgotten now, really, or multiple sisters, generations of Burks were sort of attorneys, QCs. They had chambers in London, and also I think the Three Cranes pub in Barnsley served as their sort of local office, but lived in Hemmingfield, and like he was the agent to the Dernaduff Canal, so they were selling shares. Well, they didn't trade them as you think about trading now, but they were quite fixed in ownership, but they were worth a lot of money. Because as all the trade in ironstone down the canal and iron products from the ironworks out and coal went out, there were tolls. The tolls for the Dernaduff Canal and on the Don navigation and the Aire and Calder Canal, they earned money, so you could have a very comfortable living. That's one sort of echelon of society, as well as the landed gentry. You've got these kind of entrepreneurial, quite wealthy professionals, and then you have not so much a middle class, let's say, but you have the rest. And the gap between them is still recognisable today in terms of like the super wealthy, and in some respects the inequality that we see today is technology giants maybe, but it's still comparable in terms of socioeconomic, kind of inequality. So yeah, the story of that is quite interesting as well. And I think that you don't always get the detail about that unless you do look at individual family units over time. You just sort of say, oh, they worked in a pit, they always worked in a pit. Not really, maybe the next generation didn't. Maybe the next generation got more educational opportunities. Newton Chambers, they were very good at, particularly into the 20th century, they were very good at bringing on and offering apprenticeships and educational opportunities. Interesting comparison, I suppose, to Earl Fitzwilliam, where you tend to think, oh, patriarchal, looking after his people with relatively cheap rents to have. Imagine Reform Row, where you've got kind of an allotment as well as kind of a nice house that's got modern for the time amenities. You compare that to sort of Newton Chambers, and they did look after their people as well in a different way. You can debate things like the Truck Act and like whether they were trying to sell people things and paid them in money that you could only spend at the shop. That was an early sideline. But then later on, certainly the kind of educational opportunities, I think apprenticeships is a big thing, and people do remember that. It's one of the things that, if in effect, we're missing now. Probably those opportunities to actually train, generations of the same family, but just the whole generation in this area anyway. Otherwise, without that opportunity, you do move away. People go to university or they take jobs elsewhere and they don't come back. So
it's quite interesting actually when you mention about the money they can only trade in there, because that's almost comparable to like the mining. The company stores they call
Truck Act, like the sort of I mean that's a very early bit of sort of offspring of Newton Chambers, a bit not often talked about that, but kind of like, and it did get outlawed. So, but I mean a lot of people did try and do that one way or another, whether it was through kind of renting you accommodation. There's self-interest in doing that if you're an quote unquote entrepreneur or industrial, somebody who potentially has a lot of debt to pay, don't want the money disappearing from your own pocket one way or another. I mean, Newton Chambers in some respects, because it existed so long, it sort of has perhaps a sort of a more varied legacy perhaps than just the pits, because it's not just the pits. There were sort of fabrications, there were foundries, there were pits as well, and all the chemical works, the famous Isle and toilet roll factories, which survived, much longer into my sort of into adulthood, sort of 90s really. Yes, the big elements, the big industrial bits tended to go from the 1960s onwards, after the sort of the West period. Some of that sort of patriarchal entrepreneurship kind of disappeared. I think at that point it was more about, oh, this is a big company, how can we asset strip it? But it did leave a longer legacy, I think, probably than some of the Bill Fitzwilliam stuff, because it's a slightly later period, I mean, there's a lot more that could be told about Newton Chambers, because the sheer variety of its everything from boilers to tanks in war, so there's a lot you can go at. And of course, although the ironworks in Elsecar, the Milton Ironworks themselves ended in the 1880s, yes, there's still smithies, yes, there's still the new yard which did sort of repairs and things, but it's a sort of different scale of activity that continued at Thorncliffe. So.
And I think that's actually quite poignant, linking back to what you were saying and what we were talking about earlier, this idea of almost industry or employment doesn't just go, sometimes it changes.
Yeah.
And like this, how that can compare, we can almost use the past to compare it to our present and prepare. And it sounds really, everyone hears it before, that if you don't study the past, you'll do to repeat it. But I guess there is that element, isn't there?
Yeah. I mean, people always say that history doesn't directly repeat itself. It might, like, there's echoes, but there's certainly themes you can learn from. And just in terms of sort of like the social impact of a downturn, of a complete closure of a gigantic employer, there's pretty good examples of that in this area, in lots of industrial areas in sort of in the UK, in sort of Western Europe, I suppose, as well, these post-industrial societies. And obviously it's going to change what the nature is and the level of abject poverty, if you like, that the loss of that labour could represent to the tax income for the local authorities, and therefore what services they can offer, what welfare they could offer. It's a different situation when you're talking pre-welfare state, what the impact on individuals' lives were and family lives were, to what it is now. But I think there are still sort of comparisons. And there are opportunities as well, you're right. Change is not always bad. It can be the boot to trigger you to do something. It's like, literally, I've got nothing else to do now, I've got to jump, which can be good. But it's not the easiest thing, and you wouldn't wish it on people in an instant. You want it to be a transition. And one of the things you could sort of say about, I suppose, Thorncliffe through to Elsecar and through the whole area really, is that you do have some transition. They kept coal mining as long as they could, and that survived really from, let's say before, but really 18th century through to 20th century. ironstone mining, where the local supply of coal and ironstone for the furnaces, for the foundries and the ironworks, that really had more or less been exhausted by the 1870s. And it's only really because in the coming of the railways, the canals to some extent, but the coming of the railways in the 1850s definitely meant that you could still keep an ironworks here, but supply it with mineral from elsewhere. And to some extent, that's probably why Thorncliffe also sort of stayed put, because other works did close when they'd exhausted their minerals, and areas moved on. But because you could get the transport, it was still worth the investment in the plant that you got there and the workforce that was skilled. You wanted to retain it. I think the 80s and 70s into the 80s is a bit more dramatic. The cut across all the different industrial undertakings, nationalised industries. It wasn't individual employers, it was the whole lot that kind of was sort of the bottom fell out, if you like, or was pulled out. So the impact was much bigger. But there certainly are comparisons to be drawn, parallels.
Definitely. I think the idea of transport is almost pointing, like you said about the canals and about how the canals almost led to development of these different classes, etc.
Yeah.
I think it's quite interesting note actually about how transport almost led to people could move more, but things could be moved more, and communities could be connected more rather than providing for themselves. So I think it's really, like you say, it's really important that this history of the canals is seen, I think, through like this lens, or as a wider lens of, well, it's not just that they built waterways, it's that this connected people, it allowed the transport of goods, etc.
Yeah. I mean, and there were other professions to support it, like any kind of sort of. You think of industries as sort of being vertically integrated. You create the components, or you mine the goods to create the components that build the product that gets sold. In some senses, Newton Chambers had quite high vertical integration from sort of raw material out to kind of end product, and then different sectors had more or less kind of coverage of maybe the primary extraction or the secondary working, so the coal mines or the ironstone mines, and then the sort of furnaces and foundries, ironworks, working that material. And they all had different markets which relied on transport. Without that transport, you wouldn't have been able to sustain it. Even if you'd sunk a lot of money in a great facility, if you couldn't bring materials to it and take your product away, that it would fade over time, kind of thing. I mean, it's easy as well to get over romantic about it. I do think that like you can. There's always been people that are not happy, whether it's sort of what's negatively talked about as sort of a NIMBY kind of development's not always welcome. The canal wasn't always welcome. Small landowners thought they would get their land ruined, and thinking, well, it's all very good for the major landowners, the peers of the realm with their massive mineral sort of earnings, to be able to kind of lease it out. They can keep raking money in. But if you take out the field that I'm renting, or the canal floods my field where I'm trying to grow crops, it's not going to do me any good, kind of thing. I'm going to have to move. Or that I've got no powers. The Act of Parliament that created the canal gave sort of compulsory purchase really powers, and you can kind of see sort of planning in a very modern way having sort of negative or deleterious effects in a way that development now is not always popular. So whether it's distribution units, we're talking about Cottonwood, or perhaps at Tankersley, the impact on the community. Yes, it's an employment opportunity. Is it one they want to take? Is it one that's relevant to them? It's a discussion to be had. But it would be wrong to sort of say, well, these sort of local political, economic development conversations, there's something new. It's like, well, there's always been a little bit of that in the impact. You didn't necessarily have much choice if someone else had the powers to do it, or the money to do it, or owned the land on which it was happening. But they were potentially transformative for good or bad. And I think that aspect it's sometimes quite funny to look at modern developments and think, well, actually, if we'd had the same reaction, would we have got the canal? Would we have got the railway? Yes, the situation's different, and thankfully we have a more democratic society, and men and women can vote. It's not just wealthy landowners that got the right to vote with an undemocratic system. So we're better off collectively than we were, but some of the same human problems of opposition and to change are still there, I think.
Definitely, and I think that's actually quite an important part of almost studying history, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And it's important as well in that this is difficulty with real history, or what we think of as the past in general. It's like if you've only got the same printed sources and the same voice, the same authority, the same authors coming through that, whether it's through published materials, primary materials like letters and things are great, but you've got to be literate to write. So what about the voices that you don't hear from? That's why it's important really even now to sort of think more widely than just, oh, this happened and this was the official line on it. It's like, well, what did that mean to people? What was the impact of that reduction in service or that change of service or that, was that welcome, was that not welcome? Without that context, you don't really get the full picture to understand it.
And that's a really good point, actually, because I think that speaks about a lot of, dare I say, local to here is a lot of industrial and working class lines.
Yeah.
Always the one publishing history, etc., but they have their own stories.
Oh, definitely, yeah, definitely, yeah.
And I think that's why oral history is so important as well, because people could just recall, they might not know a lot of the history, but they recall their memories and their opinions, and that's almost can shape future discussion, like you say, which is written down by a very literate or someone who has researched it.
Yeah.
I think really, actually, before we do this, you sparked me off, actually, good thinking. So, again, don't feel like if there's anything you don't want to or don't...
No, sorry, I'm blathering a bit. I'm trying to keep a line in my mind and I'm not at all.
Honestly, it's absolutely brilliant. I always say I'd rather have more to chop down.
Yeah, right. Well, you've got plenty to slash out. So.
But I think as well, really then, final point actually, it got me thinking as well about moving on to tram roads or anything like that.
Yeah.
So I think really what might be quite nice to talk about is what were the relevance of the non-water transport? What is the history regarding the industry around here with non-water transport, such as the tramways?
The tramways. I mean, the tramways are really important for moving in this area. The history of sort of, I suppose, iron tramways. You could talk about wooden tramways, but we don't really have many wooden tram roads really in this area. That's more of a sort of northeastern Durham and sort of above thing. But like the ironworks and iron plate rail on stone sleepers is really what you see when you've got all the connections between Thorncliffe and Elsecar, the tram road, sort of kind of Victorian sort of kind of transformation really. And really it was needed because the scale of activity, the sheer number of people, it wasn't just a few people kind of doing a bell pit, but they could kind of like get a horse and cart and sort of like pull something to where it was needed. It was the sheer, hundreds of people were employed in ironstone mining around Tankersley, whether it's for Thorncliffe or whether it's for the ironworks at Elsecar and at Milton. And that connection, yes, it wasn't quite the same as a canal in terms of giving you regional connectivity, but it was vital to bring the minerals and the ironstone and the coal, which could be changed into coke. The ironstone had to be calcined, had to be baked, which needed coke, which needed coal. You needed the coke when you were trying to kind of get the iron out of the iron ore, and that's where you got the furnaces, and then you got the finery, you got the sort of ironworks to make the materials for other things. Without that tram line connecting the things, it would have been a lot more laborious. You would have needed a lot more people employed to do it. Without iron tram lines, it meant you could connect into whole areas and sort of tap that resource. The tram roads or railroads, as they were called, although people tend to think that's an Americanism, it was also railroads, but let's call them tram roads. The tram roads were really important. They were actually specifically mentioned in the Canal Acts, actually, and certainly the Dun and Duff Canal and the Barnsley Canal. There were special provisions of again, a compulsory purchase or compulsory use of being able to connect the canal up to, in Wath Parish, up to 2 miles, I think it was. Or was it maybe 1 mile? But anyway, an extended distance from a canal, you could basically say, right, you could connect it with a tram road, and because it's connecting to the canal, it'll get the go-ahead. And in a sense, that was really one of the reasons why the Thorncliffe to Elsecar tram road was so important, because you couldn't get anywhere else from Thorncliffe. It was a bit landlocked at that point in time. From as I said, from the 18th century, but obviously this is mid-19th century. You've got another 20 or 30 years before the railway comes, and obviously that's really why the tram road sort of ends up getting sort of chopped down to its smaller, disconnected from Thorncliffe internal tram roads at and around Thorncliffe, and then kind of reused at sort of Skyers Spring and later Lidgett Colliery down to Elsecar via the Milton Ironworks. But that glorious period of huge activity when hundreds of people were at ironstone mining from sort of the 1830s through to the 1870s, that was the only way you were going to get that material to where it needed to be, to the ironworks, in order to kind of to work. So yeah, it was the connective tissue. I mean, the pull, as I say, really was the canal, because that was the onward movement of that material. But the ironworks and collieries. In a sense, that was the vein or the artery that kind of passed all the material back and forth.
That's absolutely brilliant. Thank you. And I think really that's all the questions I have, especially because that last comment was fantastic. Because I think the idea of calling that connective tissue, I think that really speaks to the importance of these industrial connections and really the crux of why I want to make this documentary.
Yeah.
I think really then what might be nice is just finally get maybe some shot of that map hour thing, okay, and then maybe a shot of this one if we
Yeah, this is pretty. I mean, to be honest, I'm saying that. Will you be better? I'm moving. I'm sorry.
That's
Will you? Oh no! So I'm doing the bloody thing. So you might be better. What have I done with it? With an Ordnance Survey 1850s map or something, because that has got the tram. Well, it's got some of the railways on it. Depends what period you're trying to do, because this is pre. So this will have no tram roads on it whatsoever. Some of the archive material will show the tram roads, but probably you have to look at the early first series and stuff like that to get the.
Fortunately, I do actually have a copy of that.
Okay.
The reason I specifically put that one is when you referenced it, and also the idea of before the tram road.
Oh yeah.
The
Well,
idea of the canal